Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Court-Martail Podcast. Introducing your host for this evening first. He is the host with the most from the West Coast, the Bay Area brawler, Skylar Greenberg. And his partner, he has colonized, energized, and revolutionized the podcasting wrestling world today. Your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, kinds, and flavors. Welcome to the Court-Martail Podcast, the podcast made by Smarks for Smarks for the entertainment of Smarks and everyone around who may want to hear a little bit of pro wrestling talk from two guys who love to talk about it. I am your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty, and today, as advertised, my co-host in crime, Skylar Greenberg, is not here. He is taking a little bit of time off to go relax, I hope, and do some scouting out in Europe. He's doing a UK tour, as it were. And, of course, safe travels to Sky, and we are definitely going to miss him while we are waiting for him to make his illustrious return. So today, I'm doing something that I have not done in almost a year and a half. It's a solo show, folks. It's just going to be a nice little fireside chat between you, the people out there of YouTube, and myself, your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty. And we have a lot to talk about, because this is the first podcast in October of 2022, and we've got some things to discuss. There's debuts potentially happening, or returns, as it were, that are potentially happening in the next couple of days. Of course, we've got Extreme Rules on October 8th, which is just this coming Saturday, so we're going to have to stay in tune for that. And on top of that, we've had a lot happen this week in the world of the wrestling news. And because Skylar isn't here, I'm going to have to try to do this myself, present the news and talk about it, but we're still going to keep Skylar here in spirit. And as such, roll that intro. Coming straight to you from the Golden Gate Garage, this is the WrestleNews with Skylar Green. That's right, folks. It is the news of the week with your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty, at your service. And we've got 5 or 6 things to talk about, and we're going to go at them pretty quickly. And the first one we've got is Randall Keith Orton. As reported by Dakota Cohen yesterday, September 30th of the time of recording, an update on Randy Orton's injury, as he's been out of action since the Arcade Bros match against the Usos on the May 20th. And at the time, we had speculated, or the word had been about town, that Orton had suffered some sort of back injury that he had been waiting to handle. And it just so happened to be that that was the time for it to go. And so Orton has been out of action for the past several months now. The only time we saw him was congratulating Cena on 20 years in the business. And now we are getting word that this back injury might be more severe than we think. You know, we had talked before about the potential of Randy Orton not being able to compete, but now Uncle Dave, everyone's favorite fabricator of just how good things in AEW are, let alone, you know, the integrity of wrestling journalism is not lost on Dave Meltzer, because he never had it to begin with. But he does break some news efficiently, and it sounds like there is quite a lot of concern, at least from what Meltzer is reporting. And I don't usually like doing Meltzer reports, but I want to talk about Orton here real quick, because it ties into everything else we're talking about. Orton's finisher, the RKO, made him land on his back quite a lot over the course of 20 years, and that's going to do damage to anybody. And considering that while Orton has come back, you know, he's had injuries to, you know, his triceps, and I'm sure he's got a bicep tear, and, you know, Orton's had a lot of injuries he's dealt with over the years. This back one seems, anytime I hear the words back injury, I immediately think the time is closing. And now, granted, Orton's had 20 years in the business, so it's not surprising that at this point, you know, regardless of whether he had this injury or not, he was probably going to start winding down. That being said, any back injury that you hear, no matter how bad it is, even when you get it repaired, with the exception of Ric Flair, everybody who's had a major back injury that's required surgery has never come back the same. And well, I shouldn't even exclude Flair out of that, because realistically, you look at what Ric Flair looked like prior to the plane crash in '77. I may be misdating it, but you know, you get the picture. But Flair was jacked. He was like 315 pounds. He was a big dude. And then he's in the plane crash. He breaks his back. He gets surgery. He fixes it. But Flair never was the same wrestler. It just so happened to be that he ended up being incredibly better as a result of not doing all the powerlifting and kind of learning more of the just how much depth psychologically to put in and the promos and, you know, what have you. But it is concerning to me that Orton's back injury might be more serious than maybe was let on at first. And do we see Orton in a ring again? Maybe. I think that I'm sure he wants to, if at the very least for a match, but at the same time, I don't want, you know, Orton has done pretty much everything there is to do in professional wrestling, or at least in WWE, you know, unless he feels like throwing all that away to go wrestle a couple AEW matches with a bunch of rookies, or people who work like rookies, there's nothing for Orton left to prove. And if that's the case, then I really think that if Orton wanted to kind of take a smaller role, maybe wrestle once or twice a year instead, I think that would work for him at this point. I don't think there's anything more that Randy has left as far as contributing anything different or layered, which a lot of people have critiqued him for over the past 20 years. And to be fair, he's gone 20 years without dealing with any major, like, career-threatening injuries until this. And so, I get well soon, Randy. I mean, we really do miss you, and I really am hoping that Matt Riddle and you end up having some sort of feud of consequence, especially if they're going to give Riddle a more intense attitude going forward, even though he wore the Patrick Star pants at Clash at the Castle. I guess we'll just have to see. But in any case, best of luck getting healthy, Randy. And whether we see you back in a wrestling capacity or not, we need talent, and we need names, and we need people like you, Randy. So I do hope you get better. Up next in the wrestling news, also from Dakota Cohen, and this one was from the 29th of September when this was posted. Of course, I do like to cite my sources. All of the news pieces that I grab are out of Wrestling Inc., so thank you very much for being there to find the hub. And you got to be careful sometimes with some of these places. And I will include Wrestling Inc. into this. And we'll talk about dirt sheets on another episode, because I do want to kind of go through the gamut, probably when Skylar's back on, about what wrestling news has become and where it's headed. Because there's a lot of stuff in news, and not even talking about our segment, just in general, what and how news is reported, and what is deemed good news and what is deemed news in professional wrestling, because it's different. It's different with every site, and it's different, especially because there's a lot of wrestling journalists, and I use that term very lightly, who do not know shit from apple butter about how to write an article, let alone not put their perspective into it. But in any case, we get this article here is that Intercontinental Champion Gunther appears to be getting another change in his name. And it's not the adjustment you're hoping for, folks. He's not going back to Walter. Instead, they've got Gunther. And that's what he's named now. But instead of Gunther being spelled normally, it's now in all caps to signify anger. And you know, here's the thing. I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. If you're going to keep Gunther, at least having something that recognizes that, you know, what he was in the past, even though everyone is still going to talk about Walter, You know, they even did it at Clash of the Castle, and Cole had to cover it going, oh, they're talking about Gunther's past. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's, you know, Walter. And, you know, he's not the only one who's had his name changed. I mean, remember that Ludwig Kaiser was originally Marcel Bartel. And I'm actually a little surprised that the other one in that contingent has not had his name changed yet, Giovanni Vinci. But give it time, folks. Give it time. Does this make him any better or worse? No. I mean, everything that he does up to this point, most of us, I mean, JoshAgeddon and Sky and myself are all very high on what he does. And, you know, he's doing this good old-fashioned Donnybrook match or whatever it is, which is Imperium versus the Brawling Brutes of Sheamus, Butch, who will hopefully be, speaking of name changes, hopefully be Pete Dunne once again before too long. And the worst wrestler that WWE has contracted to them and somehow is still on the roster, Ridge Holland. And that match, I don't know what this match is going to end up being when they finally get to this point where they have it. You know, we'll review it, folks. Just so you know, JoshAgeddon is going to be joining me next week, and we are going to go over all of this. We're going to go over every single thing that we've got to talk about as far as all the matches of Extreme Rules. JoshAgeddon and I are going to break it down for each and every one of you, so stay tuned. This solo thing is only going to happen once, and then we're going to get back to having people. But speaking of people, and people who maybe kind of like JoshAgeddon would do better if they were not in the spotlight nearly as much, but instead we've got a very interesting article by Phil Hall, also of Wrestling Inc., that Vice TV is reportedly releasing the Vince McMahon documentary that they had halted a while ago, and they're releasing it out in here in November. And apparently, now that through multiple sources who were interviewed, PW Insider reported that the production is going to air actually at the end of this month, and it is going to cover the sordid circumstances that led to Vince being forced to leave, which is very interesting. But it is also interesting that Vice has not really issued any statement on the documentary, and it's not cited on the website. So this is coming from PW Insider, who's pretty reliable, and they, you know, through multiple sources. If they do this, right? Because Vice TV has done a lot for professional wrestling when you think about it, especially of late. I mean, they've got the two guys who did Dark Side of the Ring, which they may revisit. Because they've done 4 seasons of that, and they were thinking about doing that. Now they've got the Tales from the Territory days, which is another one that they're going to be doing. The same group, and actually The Rock is also an executive producer on that. And that should be pretty interesting as well. So Vice has an interest in professional wrestling and telling good stories of professional wrestling. And I hope that this Tales from the Territories ones is maybe a little more lighthearted than the Dark Side of the Ring, which was great and was a wonderful expose on a lot of really messed up stuff that WWE is, and Vince McMahon, and just in general, just some of the shit heap that professional wrestling has been encompassed with for its pretty much entire existence, but definitely in its more recent history of the past 40, 50 years, let alone all the shoots and double crosses and all that jazz that started from time immemorial, but especially when organized professional wrestling began in the 1910s and 20s. So, but here's the thing. If they do this McMahon documentary, right, because they had most of this done, from what we've heard and what we have been told, is that prior to the investigation being announced, they had this pretty much done, except you knew that it was going to be more of a fluff piece and hey, it's Vince McMahon. Let's all love Vince McMahon. And now they've got these circumstances, and I just don't know how they're going to be able to cover or report about the circumstances because all of this is still ongoing. You know, we haven't heard a lot about it recently, but I think that's because it's just been in the middle of red tape, bureaucratic litigation, and trying to figure out what end is where, and the investigation isn't over. You know, there's more stuff that could be uncovered, but they've kind of slowed down in that respect now that Vince is out of the company. I just don't see how they're going to end this, because there really isn't an end to this story yet. I mean, in a lot of ways, they're kind of just closing the book right as this next chapter is still being written. And it's going to be strange to see what the original cut of this documentary was, if it is in fact airing, what that was compared to what it's now going to become, or what we're going to eventually see, given the events and what's transpired and what we know now about what Vince may or may not have done. And moreover, whether Vice was going to cover kind of that seamy underbelly of Vince McMahon, of all the stuff that Vice has already kind of brought to light about Vince, given the Dark Side of the Ring. So it's hard to say, you know, the fact that they're still planning on releasing this, I find fascinating, because they're still, I wouldn't have blamed them a bit if they had said, you know what, this is a sensitive topic right now. There's still a lot of things going on. You know, I don't know whether now is the time, and nor do I think maybe we just shelve this idea and we come back to this once we know more, and maybe we do get a period at the end of the sentence. And instead, we're going to get a very comprehensive story, but it's only going to be an hour and a half, so they're not going to cover everything. I don't know. I don't know how to feel about this one, because I don't know whether people are going to want to see a piece that makes Vince McMahon look good right now, nor do I think that people are going to want to see a documentary that just completely slams Vince either. I don't know whether people want to see this, because how could you possibly accurately cover so many things that have been buried underneath, or just not available to the public or sources, unless they've got somebody really deep on the inside giving them information? And if that's the case, then is a Vice TV documentary really the place for all of that to air? I don't know. This is a weird one for me, so we'll have to see what happens with this documentary. But I find the timing rather peculiar. You know, why now? Why do this now? If this is true, even though we have not heard from Vice TV about it, and there's no, you know, hype for it, which is also, I find, a little strange, considering that you'd think that with it being so topical, they would want to get a little, you know, publicity into it leading up to, but who knows what forces at work are here. And another question to add on to this, let's say, yes, their plan is to release this documentary. How quickly does WWE go in there and go, ha, no, not now? And if that's the case, and maybe that's why they're trying not to publicize this too much or get too much press into advertising it, is they advertise this, WWE goes, yeah, cease and desist on all of that, and all of a sudden they're out a lot of fucking money, because I'm sure that this documentary took quite a few resources to make. So it's going to be interesting to see how this interaction between Vince McMahon, the WWE in its current form, and Vice TV's, you know, attempt here to bring some attention to Vince McMahon, no matter what capacity. It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. And next up in the news, and we got two more pieces, and then we're going to move on to our topic today. Now, this one I'm only going to touch on very briefly, and I'll tell you why. Some sad news happened a couple days ago. Actually, yesterday at the time of recording. It'll be probably 3 days now by the time you guys hear this. Antonio Inoki, the politician, one of the biggest legends in Japanese wrestling history, to some may be regarded as synonymous with Japanese professional wrestling. Put it in a lot of ways on the map. Had a great territorial feud with Giant Baba and All Japan, while Inoki was New Japan, and there was a lot. You know, the fight between him and Muhammad Ali. You know, Antonio Inoki's name is not unknown to a large majority, especially Japanese professional wrestling fans, but even to a lot of American wrestling fan historians. A lot of people know who Antonio Inoki is. Unfortunately, Antonio passed away on Friday at the age of 79. And now, when I talked to Skylar, broke the news to me, and then it's been broken through multiple sources now, Hollywood Reporter, New York Post. It's getting actual news coverage. You know, proper news coverage, because that's how big a legacy Antonio Inoki has. So big, in fact, that I don't feel like I myself, as a primarily just American wrestling fan, having grown up basically just watching WWE and kind of expanding my horizons to some New Japan matches here and there and some history, but a lot of my history is more on American wrestling. I don't feel like I can do a tribute to Antonio Inoki justice here today by myself. You know, Skylar is a lot more versed in New Japan, I think. Even JoshAgeddon is a lot more versed in New Japan than I am, and the history of New Japan. And while I do know Antonio Inoki and I respect the hell out of him, I'm very sad to see him go. I don't want to take a man's legacy like this and condense it into 5 minutes. So in a couple weeks, when Skylar is back on the show, Skylar is going to lead an episode of the Court-Martail podcast, which will be the Antonio Inoki tribute. And that's going to talk about his history with how he got started in the business, how he became the business in a lot of ways in Japan, and all the people he worked with. And, you know, he was a big part of advertising that big North Korea show, speaking of Dark Side of the Ring, that drew like 120,000 people because North Korea told them to or whatever. But that was led by Inoki and Flair, was the big matchup on that. You know, it's a fascinating lifetime that Antonio Inoki has celebrated. He was big into Japanese politics. You know, he really was a staple of not only just professional wrestling, but of Japan, and for a very long time. You know, Skylar made the comparison, he's Japan's El Santo. And I'm not sure that I necessarily quite agree with that comparison, just because no one was like El Santo. Nobody on earth was the professional wrestling god that El Santo was. Inoki was big. Inoki was huge, all things considered. Maybe, perhaps even more influential in his brand of wrestling as far as Japan goes than El Santo was. But it's apples to oranges in a lot of ways. But I'm not going to talk about that more here. You're going to have to wait for that. So for those of you big New Japan fans, the Antonio Inoki lovers out there who I'm sure watch this podcast, bear with us, as we're going to give you a much more in-depth look at Antonio Inoki and the life of Antonio Inoki in a couple weeks' time. So stay tuned for that. But rest in peace. And of course, as always, here at the Court-Martail podcast, when another wrestler dies, we always give our condolences to the family, and all of the, and really to the entire country of Japan, because they've lost an icon. And I respect the hell out of Inoki, and you know, I'm sure there will be plenty of people mourning, and we will give our proper tribute. You're just going to have to wait for it a little bit. Then finally, our last little piece of news here. Now, folks, I'm only really able to do this last piece of news, and I'm bringing this piece of news up. Skylar and I could talk about this, and I'm sure that he would want to throw his 2 cents into this conversation. Especially because of the way it pertains. But this is going to go kind of in a different direction than things I've done in the past. So for those of you out there who know nothing about professional sports, please hang on, because I'm going to bring this back to professional wrestling. And I'm speaking primarily to JoshAgeddon, but I know there are more people out there who are like, I do not care about sports. I understand this. I understand that. Please bear with me here as I play the background for what I'm about to talk about, because I'm talking about AEW, but I've got to talk first about the Miami Dolphins of the National Football League, the American National Football League, not talking about soccer, talking about American football. To give a little backstory on this, Thursday night, the NFL had a football game between the Miami Dolphins and the Cincinnati Bengals. And there is the quarterback of the Miami Dolphins' name is, and forgive me, because I may mess this up. The name of the Dolphins quarterback is Tua Tagovailoa, or Tagovailoa, something like that. I did my best. Tua was about to throw a pass, and one of the Bengals defenders basically German suplexed him on his head. Not necessarily like intentionally like grabbed him and just hauled him down, but Tua hit pretty hard. And what happened was, the second that Tua landed on the ground, his hands just contorted, like he went into brain lock, basically, and his hands just stopped functioning. It's pretty it's pretty gruesome. You know, I'm not at liberty to even use that photo on this particular piece. Instead, I'm going to use a photo, and I'm sure you're seeing it, of Christopher Nowinski, and I'll explain why in a second. His head slams pretty hard. His body seizes up, and we carted off in a stretcher. He gets wheeled off on a gurney, and we have now know, here we are on Monday, that he is ambulatory. You know, he's able to, you know, he's moving around, he's able to walk, you know, he has use of his extremities. But the reason I bring this up is that this was very clearly a serious brain injury that was really caused by the fact that last week Tua was walking off the field after getting his bell rung pretty hard and could not walk. He was staggering. You know, he was staggering down, kind of like the way Sting looked when he got that buckle bomb from Rollins at SummerSlam. Kind of was how Tua looked. And now keep in mind, Tua is, I think, 25, 26. Young dude. Younger than I am. And, you know, so he's the age of Skylar and JoshAgeddon and myself. So this is, you know, we're talking about people our age here. And from the time of last Sunday, which is when they played, and Thursday, somebody okayed Tua to go out and play when it was very clear he had some sort of concussion. Now, it was reported at the time that it was a neck injury, it was a back injury, it was a head injury. We were getting multiple reports from multiple places saying he's got this, no, he's got this, no, he's got this. So it was really hard to tell which end was up. Why I'm bringing this up in a professional wrestling podcast is that Tua's head injury is so severe, it may end his career. It and probably should, because who knows what kind of long-term damage this has done to Tua's brain. Christopher Nowinski, and this, of course, this is a Wrestling Inc. article by Nick Miller. Chris Nowinski, who was a former wrestling star, Harvard graduate, and he wrestled in 2002 and 2003. He wasn't bad. He really wasn't bad, but he got a real nasty concussion, finished getting his PhD after he retired from wrestling because of that concussion, and then spent the rest of his career, that is ongoing, obviously, he hasn't gone anywhere, spent the rest of his career teaching the world about concussions and doing concussion research. He was huge into the whole Benoit dissection and, you know, figuring out all of that. Nowinski has been a huge staple in what we know about concussions, period. Not even just from WWE standpoint with the chair shots and the, you know, all of that jazz, but even in the NFL. Nowinski's been a pretty big part of concussion science. And Nowinski had a tweet regarding this injury with Tua, and this is how I'm going to kind of segue into what I'm talking about here. In light of the Tua disaster last night, I appreciate more than ever AEW's Tony Khan, WWE's Triple H, and NWA's Billy Corgan all inviting me to come teach their talent about concussions and the risk of getting in the ring before you've recovered. Protecting athletes begins with educating them. Now, prior to last night's game, and I say last night because I'm reading it from the article, but prior to the game on Thursday, Nowinski had another tweet that said, if Tua takes the field tonight, it's a massive step back for concussion care in the NFL. If he has a second concussion that destroys his season or career, everyone involved will be sued and should lose their jobs, coaches included. We all saw it, even they must know this isn't right. Because it was pretty obvious. In the game last week with Miami, it was pretty obvious that Tua got his bell rung pretty hard. And they have done so much in the past several years about concussions and hitting the quarterback, and the NFL has made rules saying, you know, really limiting. They've penalized people for hitting the quarterback hard. And they've really tried to, like, take steps They've got concussion protocol, but at this point, it's pretty clear that every organization, or at least some organizations, like the Miami Dolphins, are going to use every loophole they can to get their stars out on the field, whether they're healthy to do it or not. And Miami right now, Stephen Ross has been under a lot, the owner of the Dolphins has been under a lot of scrutiny. Prior to this, during the offseason, there was an issue with a former coach, which if you want to learn about that, you can go ahead and look it up on the internet. But now we get this situation where it's very clear that somebody did not go through the steps to make sure it was necessary that Tua was in the right state of mind or had the right had the right mental capacity. And it's hard to measure. It's totally hard to measure, but whose word was gone by? Tua's? He's concussed. You can't trust him to be like, yeah, I'm fine. Because how is he going to know? It's his brain that's getting mashed up against the side of his skull. And and here's my transition into professional wrestling. Because while it's one thing to be educated about concussions, it's one thing to know something about concussions, right? Yes, it's a good thing that Tony Khan and Triple H and Billy Corgan are all like, yeah, let's come in and do a seminar about concussions. Education is key. But at what point, with all the injuries that AEW and WWE for that matter, at least WWE's doing a little bit better because they banned certain moves like the pile driver, which nearly killed Steve Austin, and he was the biggest drawing guy that they've ever had in WWE ever, to this day, period. And, they banned certain moves. There's no more chair shots to the head, not even protected chair shots to the head, even though there's ways to do both of those things right. Just on the potential of that alone, WWE isn't taking that chance. And for what it's worth, yeah, you hear about concussions here and there about WWE, but for the most part, you don't hear about it a lot anymore. That's not to say they don't happen, but really, a lot of the time, I haven't seen anybody or heard about a lot of people dealing with concussions since Bryan Danielson, which was the whole reason. And further evidence right there. They made Bryan Danielson retire for 2 years because of concussions, because the WWE doctors wouldn't clear him because they knew what that would lead to. And that's exactly what's going on now in Miami, and whether they get a proper investigation or give a fuck about Tua in the long term, it remains to be seen. But there's actions that's been taken. The NFL, while they don't give a crap about the athletes, as they've at least tried to make it look like they do, by taking the penalties to the quarterback. And, you can only hit him at this point or here or in this part of the body or, after this amount of time after the ball's been thrown. They've used the rules to help prevent some of these situations. Does it stop them? Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Otherwise, we wouldn't have nearly as many injuries as we do. But at the same time, at least they've made some strides to try and get to that point. Now, like Nowinski said, that may all be thrown out the window if we find out that there was a whole lot of, well, we didn't follow any of the protocol because Tua's on the field and we need Tua. My point here I'm making is that it takes more than just education. It takes steps. It takes actual proactive movement by the leaders of these companies to stop and prevent, help prevent some of these things. And I'm looking at Tony Khan, and I'm looking at AEW, and I'm seeing injury after injury after. It's like every episode, every show, somebody else gets hurt. You look at the Julia Hart injury where she nearly got killed. If her head hit the back of that guardrail, she's done. Period. We talked about that before on last week's show. And at what point is Tony Khan going to finally start making strides and start doing anything about this? Personally, I wouldn't mind never seeing anybody go through a table maybe once every 6 months. If that meant protecting the wrestlers from being stupid and doing stupid stuff just for the sake of doing stupid stuff for their own health, that would be my move. Hey, Sammy Guevara, you can't huck a chair at 90 miles an hour at Matt Hardy's head. Or, if you want to go in that whole thing, you can't do a Russian leg sweep onto concrete where Matt got his bell rung hard and continued wrestling after the match. How about the one with Jeff got his bell rung hard? And then after he had severe trauma, then had head trauma, then got alcohol, and then all of that jazz. So there's so many people hurt. People have their neck broken. Kyle O'Reilly, I just heard, may have had his neck fused. Adam Cole's out with something. Ricky Starks broke his freaking neck on this program. It's constant. All of these injuries are constant. And what is done to help these athletes do better? Because nobody's training them to work better. They're not taking the advice to work better. And Tony's not making any strides on himself to make sure that his talent is protected. And remember when he said, oh yeah, everyone's going to have health insurance. Then he started seeing how stupid these people were doing all this stupid stuff and said, that's going to fucking bankrupt me. I'm going to be bankrupted if I fund every single person's here's health insurance. But look at the people. Look at what's happened to this company. Look how many people are injured from this. And if you're not going to give them health insurance, and you're not going to tell them or give them people to help them work better, and you're not going to tell them what to do or how to do it, or that you're not doing this, ban or do something. Do fucking something, Tony Khan. Anything to protect these athletes. Even if they're not proper athletes, even if they're a bunch of schlubs, like most of the roster in AEW is. But that doesn't mean that any of those people deserve to get crippled. That doesn't mean that any of those people, Orange Cassidy, I may not like Orange Cassidy's work. I may hate the plate kicks. But do I want to see his neck broken and his head bashed against his own skull until it turns into a brain pancake? No. Because he doesn't deserve that. But that's exactly what's going to happen if Tony doesn't do something. It's not enough. It is not enough to just bring Christopher Nowinski in here to pull up a PowerPoint about how your brain can turn into scrambled eggs if you get your bell rung too many times. Everybody knows the dangers of concussion and CTE. That doesn't mean shit if the owner of that company isn't willing to do something about it. And he's not willing, and half the time, it seems to me like Tony Khan won't be satisfied until one of two things happens. Either somebody gets the Darren Drozdov effect, where they end up in a wheelchair sipping out of a tube their whole life, or someone properly dies on AEW television. And you want to talk about getting renewed with the network and what will end that in a heartbeat. That right there. And you know who they just signed? They just signed Paige or Soraya, who had to retire for 5 years because of exactly that. And she said she's damaged, but that sounds like she's gonna wrestle to go change the women's division. Are you out of your goddamn mind, Tony? Don't answer that. We already know the answer is yes. But the reason I'm getting so worked up about this, because if the NFL, at least in their defense, it's a very physical sport. And it is a sport, right? It's a sport, it's a contest, it's a team sport, there's athletes, and whether you believe it's predetermined or not, that's a different story regarding money and ownership and all that jazz, but a lot of that's just happenstance. There's no reason, with the exception of a couple freak accidents, which happen all the time, but there's no reason that there should be this many people injured on AEW television. There's no reason for it. And WWE too. There's no reason for that. But these people are doing too much and nobody's there to tell them no. Nobody's there to tell them don't do this. Hey, maybe a dead eye onto a table, onto the outside, wearing a crown of thorns is the dumbest goddamn idea I've ever heard. But nobody's willing to say that. And nobody's telling Tony Khan that this is going to blow up in his face to where he's going to be dealing with lawsuits and no television for the next 5 or 6 years that their TV deal was going to be, if somebody breaks their neck and dies or has a stage 4 concussion and ends up killing themselves because of their mind is so messed up that they don't have any other option in their mind than to do that. And this is a big part of the reason why I have zero respect for Tony Khan and I cannot watch their program. Even with the Bucks out of the equation, even with Omega out of the equation, I gave up on that show with Punk there because of just the stupidity involved. Because they're not, I don't know whether they're not thinking about it. I don't know whether anyone's talking about it. They have doctors. How good are their doctors? Are they even doctors? Because we know the kind of executive positions that were given out to people that were clearly unqualified. Do they even have proper doctors? Maybe that's part of the reason why Tony Khan took away the health insurance in the first place. Because he knew his doctors were crap, so he didn't want to pay for good ones. And it's infuriating to someone who doesn't want to see people get hurt like that. I mean, yeah, again, freak accidents happen all the time. Drozdov was a freak accident. That was a complete accident. And it happens. You know, things happen. Owen Hart, you know, again, that's an extreme case with a little different set of circumstances, but at the same time, do you really want to take that chance? Do you really want to take that chance, Tony Khan? But at this point, I don't even think you're even at the capacity where you're even able to think about this, because you've melded your mind into thinking that you're a genius booker, and your entire mind is writing names on paper that make no sense and disrespect smarks everywhere who used to do that in their basement and actually made some goddamn sense. And you've disrespected smarks everywhere with your crap booking. You've disrespected your talent by not trying to take care of them. And you disrespect all the fans by throwing out this happy horse shit and letting people do what they want, even if it means that they're going to end up in the hospital for the next 6 months. And you want to talk about a horror show. Remember when Extreme Rules was called the horror show? That's AEW right now. If you're a wrestler in AEW and you want to have a long career, that place is a horror show. But speaking of horror, that's going to move to our topic today. 40 minutes into the program, we've got to talk about horror gimmicks in wrestling. Because it is October after all. It is now spooky season, as it were. And there's nothing more spooky than a properly done horror gimmick / character. And I will use the word character here because that's really what they are. And we've had a few of them. It's a more modern thing. I mean, there's guys that have been scary in the past. You know, people like Kamala, you know, to the uneducated, you know, who Sugar Bear Harris really was. But intimidation and being scary was different back in the territory days, because it wasn't necessarily like, oh, let me dress up in a costume and look, you know, with the face paint and look all, you know, scary. It was more, oh my God, look at the look in Terry Funk's eye. He might just kill Jerry Lawler tonight. Or look at the Sheik going down into the ring, striking fear into the hearts of his opponents and everyone in the front row. Because nobody wanted to fuck with the Sheik. Because the Sheik had the look in his eye of, I will kill everybody here and will not be sad about it. You know, as funny as he is, I'm sure people felt that way about New Jack. Walked seeing him coming around. Probably that guy who got stabbed 9 times probably had that look. Probably saw that look. You know, it's one thing to be horrifying in a, this dude is fucking unhinged kind of way. In a believable kind of way. When you get into gimmicks and horror gimmicks, you gotta have exactly the right guy with exactly the right gimmick in exactly the right set of circumstances. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Because it comes off as far too hokey. I mean, for lack of a better phrase, but you know, a lot of the hokiness that really Vince McMahon and his cartoon character style of wrestling brought into the fold in the 80s, a lot of that was really, was part of the whole aura, right? And it started, I don't want to say, well, it really started with The Undertaker. And you want to talk about a guy who is exactly lightning in a bottle. That gimmick would have worked with a grand total of 0 other people. 0. Nobody could have pulled that off. And who would have thought a 6'10" ginger in Mean Mark Callis would end up being the greatest character in the history of professional wrestling, doing a spooky gimmick with supernatural stuff that, yeah, it's silly. The supernatural stuff was always silly, and how The Undertaker survived so much crappy shtick over the course of his career is also a testament to Mark. You know, like the levitating after getting put in the casket by Yokozuna at the Rumble 94. And all of the lightning and getting, I mean, the casket match where Kane set Taker on fire. That was pretty intense, right? That wasn't necessarily like the spooky supernatural stuff, but like the lightning bolts into the ring posts and stuff like that. And there are certain things that definitely help the aura, like the sit up and some of the, the ways that Taker made that his own. But the gimmick itself, you're a wrestling grave digger. Just on paper, it's not intimidating. But you get that pale white face and you see the stone cold, uncaring eyes that roll into the back of his head, and you're like, oh my God, what's he capable of? And then go in there, you believed in the Undertaker more than you believed in the gimmick, but the gimmick enhanced what the Undertaker was doing, and it was this perfect marriage of scary and quality. And it really, I remember being a kid, 13, 14 years old, I'd watch a SmackDown, I'd have my lights off in my room, the Undertaker's gong go off, and the lights would go down in the arena, and 13-year-old me got a little scared. Because it was the aura, it was the attitude, it was the presentation of the whole thing. And all of that has to be a perfect mixture, otherwise it does not work. Kane, another great example. They struck gold with Kane without even realizing it. I mean, because they put Kane in there and they had him do the fire, but again, that was because he was the brother of already the Undertaker, who had had the supernatural stuff. And say what you want about the urn giving Taker powers. Again, there was a lot of hokey stuff that Taker had to deal with that he advanced himself with despite it. But then, again, he translates over and then he does like the sacrificing thing and becomes like the cult leader, which ends up doing better for him. And then after that, he becomes just Biker Taker. And then a lot of the whole hokiness stuff, except for burying Paul Bear in oatmeal, just because he felt like it at Great American Bash 2004. For every one of those moments, though, there's another one that you could say, wow, that gave me chills. Just the gong as the entrance came in until that became kind of a meme. But even that set the tone. That can work. But that is 95% Mark Calloway's doing and maybe 5% the gimmick. And the gimmick was necessary for what Taker would become. Right? So I'm not trying to diminish that, but at the same time, you got to have the right guy. Glenn Jacobs just so happened to be the right guy to be Kane. Did anyone believe he could set fire by himself? No, but he would still do the pyro. And every time he did the pyro, you're like, oh God, this guy has, some control of fire, even though you didn't really believe he had control of fire. Again, it was part of presentation. With the mask and they added, and then Kane was the one who gave me more nightmares than Undertaker did. I had straight up nightmares of Kane. Even when he unmasked, I had nightmares of Kane, even though he just looked like a bald dude with some soot on his face. Didn't matter. Didn't matter to teenage me. He could have had his mask on, mask off. Wouldn't matter. He was scary to me. And even when he did have his mask off, he would have, like, with the contact lens in his eye and the way that he just, like, he'd laugh, and it was just, it was perfect. That was scary. You did not want to see Kane at your doorstep on Halloween night. You know what I mean? That you would not want at all. And really, it's no surprise that he ended up getting his own horror movie in See No Evil, no matter how good or bad it was on May 19th. He had his own horror movie, which basically further proves the point. But it has to be right. Because for every one of those, we get Waylon Mercy. And while Waylon Mercy was a good idea, and I think that there was potential for it, and Spivey did a good job, or he tried to, when he was given it, but by that time his body was so fucked up, he wasn't going to be able to do dick all of anything with it. But You want to talk about where the inspiration for Bray Wyatt came from? There's a lot between one or the other that made, that did something about that, and that's the interesting thing with Bray Wyatt, because Bray Wyatt is one of those very interesting guys who had it work in some cases and not in other cases. And it really meant, and this is where the timing part of this matters. And also another thing is, with these horror gimmicks, you've got to take them seriously enough to book them properly. And that can be silly sometimes, but like, look at the way Mankind was. And Mankind was kind of a horror gimmick before it kind of, you started to see the real side of Mick Foley. But at its origin, he was a guy sitting petting rats in a boiler room. There's like, this dude's a little cuckoo. And, there was, again, it has to be the right guy with the right circumstances in the right place. But Foley didn't really get over as Mankind until they started seeing him for who he really was, which is one of the nicest human beings in history when it comes to professional wrestling. With Bray, the swamp master, for lack of a better phrase, it worked, especially when there was so much intrigue at the beginning, and he's got the whole world in his hands, and the thing with Cena, but then he loses every major feud he's in. He explodes a television at Dean Ambrose on a Hell in a Cell match, and then they beat his ass into powder. Doesn't matter how many feuds he's in or what he does. Carries Taker off at the end of the Brock Taker Hell in a Cell, and then does absolute, and then just like, I'm now the evil man round here. Look at my visual effects. Points lightning, does the, opens his arms and the fire is like, I'm now Spirit Man. And it just didn't work because he'd already been beaten to shit prior to that, and nobody had any credibility with him anymore. Then he turns into the Fiend, and everybody's reinterested again in the horror character. And then they make him champion, which was never going to work because he had to lose to somebody, and then it ended up being Goldberg of all people. And then the Fiend got set on fire, and then the cinematic matches and the Firefly Funhouse and all of that jazz. Trust me, folks, we're going to get to that. But the bottom line is that for every Undertaker where it's lightning in a bottle, you get the zombie. For every Kane, you get melted shredder Bray Wyatt as the Fiend, who lost to Alexa Bliss with the Black Crown of Thorns, or what? I don't even remember. What a weird time that was in WWE, where Bray Wyatt's cinematic gaga ended up taking over most of WWE because it was the pandemic. But it really made a point, I think, in Bray Wyatt's career, whether he was going to properly become what they had anticipated he would be in the same lines as Undertaker and Kane. It really had to be against the guy who had that mantra and had that crown to begin with. And those two first came to blows at WrestleMania 31, which leads us to our match of the week. Roll it.
What time is it?
It's the fight, it's the brawl, it's the match of the week. It's tonight, watch along with the son of a beat. It's one fall, the down for the 1, 2, and 3. So don't stall, hang on to the edge of your seat. We got a punch and a flip and a powerbomb too. All the moves and the stars are all under review. See the baby face cheer, then the heels get heat. This is wrestling at its peak. It's the match of the week.
That's right, folks. It is our match of the week. And this week, we have a match that I have wanted to watch for some time and haven't, because Skylar believes that this match is a big old bag of booty holes. And not booty-os, booty holes. Difference. One is tasty. The other is, well, depends on who you talk to. But I don't personally like a big old bag of booty holes. Whether Skylar does is a different story. But he'll tell us about that. How many bags of big old booty holes do you think Skylar likes and will find in Germany? Bet on it on DraftKings right now. And the only way you're going to know whether Skylar likes a big old bag of booty holes is if you like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell button. You switch it to all. So that way, every time Skylar's Big Old Bag of Booty Holes is posted. You will get to know about it, as well as our Extreme Rules review and that Antonio Inoki tribute and all of the great programming that Court-Martail Podcast has to offer. Undertaker versus Bray Wyatt, WrestleMania 31. Now, when I watched this match live, it was my first WrestleMania. It was the first WrestleMania I watched on the network. It was the first WrestleMania I think I'd ever watched, period. Like, full-blown watched. Even though I had, like, classes and it was through a big meeting that I was running, I was watching it regardless. And this match, I remember liking very fondly. For a couple reasons. Now, contextually speaking, gotta lay a little bit of background, back work here. This was a year after. Speaking of concussions, actually, this is all tying together very well. This was a year after Brock defeated Taker to end the streak at WrestleMania 30. And there was the big concussion and the question whether Taker was ever going to wrestle again or how he was going to wrestle. And Bray Wyatt was kind of feeding this in as like, I have to beat the Undertaker. Kind of describing what we were just talking about of, I'm going to be this man. I am going to be the future Face of Fear, which is, of course, the whole thing that what they build this whole match on. But in order to do that, I have to beat the Undertaker. Now, the hype up to this matchup was garbage. The entire build up to WrestleMania 31 was garbage. The fact it knocked it out of the park as hard as it did is actually amazing. But this whole thing was set up by 2 months of Bray Wyatt going, I'm going to fight the Undertaker at WrestleMania, and Taker not responding at all. Until finally Bray's like, what's it going to take? What's it going to take? On the go-home show, there's a video package, a gong. Taker says yes, rest in peace, and then we just wait to find him out here. And this matchup, while Skylar thinks it's a big old bag of booty holes, I still think it holds up. I think it holds up. Now, is it the greatest match on the show? No. Is it even in the top 3 matches on the show? No. I don't think so. But it was still on the show and the people were still into it. And I think a lot of people wanted to know what Taker was going to look like after what we saw, because we hadn't seen him in a year, where he had to go back and really figure out what was going on and in his life, and now he's coming back because he's got to redeem himself right after that last match. We've heard that a lot about Taker, especially in the years going forward after this match, which we'll talk about in a second. Taker comes out and he's got the Rudy Giuliani special in his hair. It looked like it was about to start leaking at any point. I'm surprised it didn't, actually. But you could tell where he kind of stopped because, like, right at the bottom of his line, you could see just that little bit of red. But he's got short hair. Bray Wyatt still looks like a bum out of the swamp, but that was his thing at the time. And he had not been beaten into powder yet. He lost in a feud to Cena, but it had not gotten to the point of Wyatt is trashed as it would be for the next 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, including a repackaging. But there is no denying that this match had some sloppy moments. And while Taker is over enough to conceal them, it is not the case for Bray Wyatt here. And I think that's kind of my biggest critique of this, is that Bray Wyatt did not look like he was on the level of The Undertaker. Pretty much on the whole match. Even if you're leaving, the storytelling aside, the execution of what he did, all of the little moves and the maneuvers and the nuances. Yes, Bray has some very good acting ability. His facials are very good. When he's decent when he sells. But one of my biggest critiques of this is that Bray relies too much on that, to the point where when he does the actual wrestling, it looks like shit. And it really didn't tighten up until the last minute and a half to 2 minutes of this matchup. It starts with a big boot as Bray runs in. Then it's just a big old Undertaker nostalgia wave, right? He gets the big, he gets a boot. He throws him out of the ring. He's laying punches. JBL, of course, says best pure striker because we can't have an Undertaker match without saying those words. And of course, there's a wonder of, is he done? You know, what happened with Taker and what happened with Lesnar? Is that going to affect him? He throws Bray out. He does the leg drop on the apron. Again, it was all of the Undertaker pieces that I know they did that to shine him because they wanted to make him look like he was fresh and that he was a lot more mentally cognizant than he was at WrestleMania 30. And this goes back and forth. You know, this goes not necessarily back and forth, but Bray gets a little bit of offense in, but Taker's really starting to lay it in. The fans chant, "You still got it." And then things start kind of getting bumpy. Taker gets Bray up for a snake eyes and cannot land it. I mean, he lands it, but a lot of the time in Taker in his youth, he'd pick the guy up and he'd kind of boast him up a little bit, kind of use his knees and lift him up just a little bit so that the impact of his head was a lot more dramatized when he actually hit his head on the turnbuckle and could reel back and stumble and fall and whatever. He couldn't get Bray up to do that little wind up. And so it didn't look nearly as clean or noticeable, really. I mean, it was a snake eyes, but it was like a snake eye. He didn't necessarily get both of them. And then, as a result, Wyatt clotheslines him and then puts in that dumb, ineffective submission that Jake Hager does, where it's like a triangle, but he's not actually, like, applying pressure to anything. And it's very obvious it's not. And you could tell the commentators were confused because they couldn't call it. They're like, it's a submission, and what's gonna happen? And then they kind of just had to go off and talk about something else. But that didn't look any good at all. But I do have to say, I love the way that one of the best things about Undertaker, I think, is his stagger sell, where he puts his hands up, but he's still staggering. Like, he looks very woozy and beaten, but and really beaten down, but he's got his hands up like, I'm barely with it, but my hands are up, which means we're still fighting. Nobody sells like that. Nobody. To this day, nobody sells like that. And and it's so unique to Taker. The only person that's close is Eddie Kingston, or at least it was. I haven't seen a Kingston match in a while. But it's very unique to Taker. And the first time I remember seeing it at all, and this might have been the first time he did it, I'm not quite sure, because it was later in his career that he adopted it, at least from the time that I saw it, was actually against Vladimir Kozlov, when they were trying to sell him as this unbeatable Russian with white tights. And Kozlov just beat him down, and then Taker did that, and you're like, oh my God. Taker's getting the crap kicked out of him in a way you had not seen before. I guess that match against Khali, he did it. Even though I try to erase that match out of my brain as often as I can. Because that match was so bad. You want to talk about a bag of booty holes? That match is a bag of booty holes. Not Great American Bash. Judgment Day, 2006. You don't watch it. That's all I gotta say. But then this is where I started really losing favor with the Bray Wyatt half of this match. Taker's over. Everything Taker does is getting a response. Bray's doing stuff and it's kind of getting reaction. But the problem is Bray does a little too much stalling, and it's stall selling, and it's always hurt his matches because it's not necessarily done at the wrong time, but it's done at a time where taking that much time slows things down and grinds things to a halt. Like, Taker's down and Bray's just like laying in the corner, not even really selling any injury of any chance. He doesn't really look like he's hurt. He's just kind of looking around, laughing a little bit, and it just slowed everything down. And then he finally gets out of the ring and pulls Taker's head for easily the worst spot of the whole match, where Taker's head is on the ring post, steel steps are below him, Bray Wyatt runs back and goes to run up and clotheslines the top of the post, hits his knee on the steel steps, and does a senton flip over the stairs and lands, and sells like he got hurt because he basically ran himself into the stairs, didn't hit Taker, didn't look like it hit Taker, didn't sound like he hit Taker because the ring posts don't sound like the steel steps. And it was obvious and people went, oh, but it wasn't like, oh my God, he just hit him in the head with his head next to the ring post. Despite Michael Cole's best efforts, it looked like, hey, you just did a Jeff Hardy Swanton over the Undertaker and hit your knee in the process, you dumb idiot. And it didn't look like anything. It wasn't very good. And then they move forward a little bit. Bray goes to get Taker, and Taker hits him into the Hell's Gate, and Bray throws 3 of the crappiest punches I have ever seen. Didn't even get close to Taker's body, let alone his head. Didn't even get close to his body as he was trying to counter out of that, which Taker eventually released. But you can tell why he's milking so much, because he has to do that in order to compensate for the fact that his shit just doesn't look very good. At least it didn't in this match, and I'm sure that if we went and watched other Bray Wyatt matches, we would find a lot of similarities. You know, this is really, I feel like, is the archetype for this. The one really good move he hit was Skyler's favorite move, the Uragi. That he looked great, and Taker sold beautifully. It was wonderful. And that was probably the biggest thing that he did, and the best thing, the thing that got the most reaction, really, wrestling-wise. Because then he goes for a cover, Taker kicks out, Bray goes to get him up, Taker counters, Taker hits a tombstone 1-2 kick out. Looked surprised. Not necessarily the meme like the one with Shawn Michaels, but he looked surprised. It's nice to see Bray kick out of a tombstone. But they go from that into the shittiest Sister Abigail I have ever seen. It literally, there was no setup. It was literally just, hey, fall down with me. And that's what happened. And they did the cover 1-2 kick out, no surprise. And then they did the best spot. Then they did the best spot of the match. And of course, because Bray Wyatt's wrestling is not the feature here, the best spot of the match is when Bray gets the crab walk, and he's crab walking towards Taker, and Taker sits up and fucks with Bray, and Bray gets shook. And that got a huge pop, and it got the crowd into it. And even still, I'm like, okay, that's still a pretty cool moment for the two of them, you know, where Bray's trying to get into Taker's head, and Taker just sits up, and that just totally messes with him. And then they go in, and then perfect timing to go into the 1-2 there. And that's where Bray's stuff, now we're in the final 90 seconds, now Bray's stuff starts looking solid. His uppercut punches look good. Taker's back look good, you know, and then Bray's just desperate, beating him down. And this is where this really picks up. Structurally speaking, there's nothing about this match that I dislike, structurally. With the exception of the spot with the steel steps, which was completely unnecessary and uncalled for. And considering what we were going to get with both the ring post and the steps later on in the night, not necessary. They do the 1-2 set up, and then they get into it. They've gotten the people more into it than they were before. And he goes in, Bray Wyatt goes in, and of course goes for another Sister Abigail, gets countered, Taker gets him up, tombstone 1-2-3, because this was the redemption match, which you had to know Taker was going to win. And again, here's the interesting thing, because realistically speaking, you're listening to the crowd, this is the outcome that had to happen. Taker had to win it. Because Bray was not even getting heat. He was getting, And even at this time, that was kind of indicative, and I think that's probably what Vince was looking at when Bray kept getting beaten all the time. And the problem is, Vince just had no idea that it was because Vince was making Bray get beaten all the time that people reacted that way. Because there was just that disconnect that Vince had with the fans at that point, had for the final 12 or 13 years of his tenure as the booker. But regardless, it was still a good match. It wasn't a great match. It wasn't one that's going to go down the annals of time as like, oh, what a legendary WrestleMania match. But I will say that this was probably the last match of Taker's I actually enjoyed full-fledged. Like, the matches with Brock, they were good, But again, then they did this thing with Wyatt at the end of the Hell in a Cell, which didn't help. You know, Wyatt was not a factor in what made those good. The match with SummerSlam ended in a disqualification, which made no sense, and make Taker look like the heel, which may have been what they were going for, but that was a very strange dynamic between the two. You know, after that, then he has that god-awful match with Roman Reigns, where Roman Reigns says, "This is my yard now." Then after that, he goes into the match, we missed the Shane McMahon Hell in a Cell match. Right. There's that weird piece of business, which really wasn't that good except for the fall that Shane took. Everything else really was not good about that match. Not really. Just Taker beating down Shane. Shane going, "Yes, Daddy, more." And Taker going, "I am your under daddy." Or Daddy Taker? I don't know which. Daddy Taker implies that you're stealing fathers. I don't think that's necessarily what we're going for here. I think Taker Daddy's probably the best we're going to get out of that. But for all of you folks who are into that sort of thing, you know, keep us posted. What is the proper terminology when referring to Undertaker as your daddy? Let us know in the comments below. And then after that, then he had, you know, after the crappy match, he had the match with Shane, then he had the crappy match with Roman Reigns, and then the 3-minute squash with Cena, which doesn't even count, and then the bad match at Saudi Arabia, which led to the better tag match with him and Roman, and then, or whatever the better match was that he had after that, because then he had the god-awful Goldberg match, and then that tag match with Roman. I think the tag match with Roman happened first, and then, you know, it just became this vicious cycle, and none of those matches were what this was. To me, this was the last of Taker's, you know, quality work, and then the rest of it just kind of, it just fell off. It just fell off, and it happens to everybody. He was in his 50s at this point. Like, what do you want from this guy? But the bottom line here is that this match was better than I think Skylar wants to believe, because Skylar has already got it in his head that it's a big old bag of booty holes. And I'm sure that if Skylar watched this, yes, there's bad moments in this match, but there's also good to be taken from this. And considering what we were going to get from Taker going forward, I think you've got to consider this one as a pretty decent match. As far as the career of Bray Wyatt after this, well, why don't we just get into it, okay? Our superstar spotlight is Wyndham Rotunda, also known as Bray Wyatt, and Husky Harris. And, of course, for Bray, third-generation talent, his father, Mike Rotunda, also known by many as IRS, and of the grandson of Blackjack Mulligan. And he's got, you know, so definitely in the wrestling lineage, he's had quite a lot of wrestling gifts. Same thing, you know, brothers with Bo Dallas. Barry Windham is his uncle. And Kendall Windham. We never talk about Kendall Windham, but he's another adequate worker. You know, so they've got a pretty extended family. He started in developmental. He's one of those guys who's one of the very few talents that has really stayed specifically and exclusively within WWE's umbrella. You know, starting in FCW in 2008, and from pretty much between 2008 and 2012, he was on FCW before they rebranded to NXT. But he did get a moment in 2010 and 2011 that everybody likes to just dump on now, and he got quite a lot of chants from Smark fans as Bray Wyatt during his Husky Harris days, where he was a part of the Nexus. And then, you know, we all know what happened to the Nexus, and we'll talk about that at another time. And it's a little sad that they didn't somehow incorporate that and Cena basically destroying that faction into Wyatt's whole approach with John back in the day, especially because John was so intertwined with the Nexus and really a big proponent of their defeat as far as their legitimacy is concerned. But then he re-debuts in NXT, but not for very long, with Brody Lee, also known as Luke Harper, and then Eric Rowan, and the Wyatt family is born. And this is really where we start to see just how quality Bray Wyatt's promo ability is. And that's always been his biggest strength, is he's got a very Jake Roberts-ish ability about him, where, and kind of going back into the line of people who are horrifying without really being a horror gimmick. Jake the Snake Roberts, perfect example of that. It's the way he looked at you, the way he spoke to you. And a lot of the ways, that's what made Wyatt work. That's what made Bray Wyatt work with the Swamp, with sitting in the rocking chair, cutting the promos where you may not understand quite what he's saying, but you're mesmerized by it. You're lulled by what he's saying to you, because it's just, there's something different. There's something different about the way that he talks and the way that he speaks and the way that he conducts himself. And it was something so palpable. And I know I'm glossing over a lot of the NXT stuff, or the NXT and the, the whole Nexus deal. He really wasn't that important in the grand scheme of that whole thing. When he really starts to become something is with the Wyatt family, especially the way they debut and how they debut. And really, it started in May 27th of, I believe it was 2013 at this point with NXT, which was starting to become the Triple H version, not the reality show version, but the Triple H version that became the hottest professional wrestling company in the world, or the professional wrestling brand, for about probably about 4 or 5 years. But Bray Wyatt was right at the beginning of that. And it started with the vignettes that he was coming in to take John Cena, right? And that ended up becoming what ended up being the Cena and Wyatt feud. Now, he had done quite a few things before that, because he was teasing that the Wyatt family were coming. They were doing vignettes in May, and they made their debut on the July 8th episode of Raw in 2013, where they attacked another horror gimmick, because the first thing that the new horror gimmick has to do is beat the old horror gimmick. Even though Kane was... No, I guess he was still that embrace to hate Kane, but it definitely had diluted a bit because he was going to turn into corporate Kane before too long. But then they started just beating up everybody. R-Truth, Justin Gabriel, pretty much 3MB, and, all the joke wrestlers were the guys who ended up being cannon fodder for him as the Follow the Buzzards tagline started being added. And then it was just like going after very specific people, and then they had the, Wyatt family began feuding with Punk and Daniel Bryan, which led to their Survivor Series match in 2013. But what really started captivating fans in a major way about the Wyatt family, yes, it was a big part was Daniel Bryan and what they did with Daniel Bryan, because Bryan was at that point where he was about to become the hottest. Let me rephrase that. He was the hottest professional wrestler in the world at that point. Even though they had tried to do Cena and Orton at Survivor Series or TLC, whatever the hell it was, to unify the titles, nobody cared, because the Yes Movement was in full swing and it was at the top of its game. And that's when they had that whole feud with Wyatt that forced Bryan to become part of the Wyatt family for 2 weeks, and then decided, yeah, I'm not going to do that. But then, of course, they're still trying to build up Bray Wyatt, so Wyatt beats Bryan at the Rumble, because again, it's another just step towards what Danielson was going, Danielson now, but Daniel Bryan was going to do heading into WrestleMania 30. Meanwhile, Bray Wyatt set his sights towards John Cena and started to speak very truthfully about how John Cena's whole do your best and, never give up and all of that wasn't really John Cena. He puts on a good show. He puts on a good mask. But the man behind the mask is not the man that you see in front of you with the Fruity Pebble t-shirts telling you all of these things, that you need hustle and loyalty and respect. But at the end of the day, John Cena is none of these things. And he's going to prove it to him at WrestleMania 30. And boy, what this would have done for Bray Wyatt if he had been able to pin John Cena at WrestleMania. But it's Big Match John, Maggle. And with Vince McMahon in charge, we cannot have that. Especially because during that match, Bray Wyatt really kind of was proven right with the way that John Cena behaved, which was a great part about that match. But it really did Bray a lot of damage not winning the feud that was going to turn him into the star that he should have been. And Wyatt is one of those guys, kind of like Kevin Owens, where the potential for them to become a major star, to get over, to be recognized by a mainstream group of people, was squashed because Vince McMahon wanted to make sure that John Cena never lost a feud. Unless it was to somebody like Brock Lesnar at SummerSlam, which is where that definitely should have gone to instead of Bray Wyatt. If you cannot hear my sarcasm, but then it started getting bad. Then it started getting rough because then after Cena buried Wyatt under multiple equipment cases, after that weird steel cage where Cena was going to walk out, but then a child started singing to him because Bray Wyatt loves the kids. That's canon. Long before JoshAgeddon made that promo on SWCG, it had been long established Bray Wyatt liked children. In kayfabe. Clarifying. In kayfabe purely. I know nothing about the man himself. And, of course, they ended that feud, which was silly. And then Wyatt then became... he started just kind of meandering around. They had a Wyatt and Jericho feud that I'm pretty sure that Jericho won. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Wyatt escaped the steel cage match with Jericho because everyone, and that might have been the best thing for him because anyone that gets into a feud with Jericho will end up worse than they did when they went in. That's been canon for a decade, and it has not stopped. And in that same way, Bray Wyatt was never really the same, so he had to try and redeem himself. And the way he redeems himself to get himself better is to have a television explode in Dean Ambrose's face during a match between Dean and Seth in 2014. And they have the TLC match where Wyatt won because a couple of times he actually won matches. Unfortunately, it's against Dean Ambrose where that didn't really matter because then he goes into another big feud, this time challenging The Undertaker a bajillion times. And then The Undertaker beat him, as we just saw in that matchup. And that really was the beginning of the end of Bray Wyatt being considered in any way legitimate or viable or acceptable as a major star. Because every considerable feud after this, he lost. They did that Shield thing with Reigns, Ambrose, and Jericho at Night of Champions of 2015. And I'm just kind of glossing over here because then, because they do that and they won that. So that's, I guess, nice. Even though like the next pay-per-view afterwards, Roman Reigns beat Wyatt in a Hell in a Cell. And then they dragged off Taker after their feud because, again, this was in we have to have multiple cell matches on one night just to make sure that none of them feel important the way they did before. And, of course, I'm missing a key piece here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't add it. Braun Strowman. The beginning of Braun Strowman. And here we are in 2022, and he's just come back, and people are kind of excited to see him. Even though I got slammed by Otis the other week, even though that should never happen to to Braun Strowman ever. But a big reason why Braun Strowman was even relevant in a lot of ways, at least at the beginning, even though he was super green, was because of Bray Wyatt and what Wyatt was able to do. And it's actually because of Strowman's return that has gotten people to wonder, well, maybe Bray is coming back, and we'll talk about that in a second. They have the feud with the Brothers of Destruction, which they lost. They beat Team ECW in a match that did not matter and had no reason to matter. They didn't even have a match at Mania 32 because they had that... I forgot about this. They had the match where The Rock beat Eric Rowan in 6 seconds. I forgot about that. Where literally The Rock just takes his shirt off going, I'm having a match. Eric Rowan's like, all right, I'll fight you. Ding, rock bottom, good night. And that really was the sign. You know, they started feuding with the League of Nations. And then they just meandered around. Even when they did the brand split, you know, it was Wyatt facing Kane again. And then Orton. We started this show with talking about Randy Orton, and here we are at the end of the show talking about Randy Orton. Because then he gets into who I consider to be his greatest rival, and also the person he should never have had any interaction with ever at any point in any universe ever. Because what Orton and Wyatt did was become intertwined with each other in the worst way possible. They had a grand total of 0.5 good matches over the course of the next 5 years. The last of which ended up getting him fired or released from WWE. Yeah, so they start doing they do the Soul Survivors and the 5-on-5, and you know, Wyatt's just messing with Orton, so Orton's like, you know what, screw it, I'm gonna join him. And then they do that, Orton wins the Rumble, Wyatt wins the Elimination Chamber, becoming WWE Champion about 3 years too late, because if he had beaten Cena and beaten Taker, he would have been considered main event immediately. Instead, they put it on him when it means as little as it possibly can, almost just in the literal sense as a stepping stone to get the belt back on Orton, which people did not really want. And then there's that Mania match. There's that Mania match where he had the screen of maggots and grubs and stuff that interrupted the match. And this is part of what I'm talking about with Wyatt. He always needs some sort of external shtick to hide the fact that he's just not that good of a wrestler. It's the facts. That match would have been fine had all of that screen supernatural stuff that made no sense, that was clearly not his doing, by the way, that was preset for him, which made it look fake and stupid. And then, if I remember it correctly, after the last one of those, Bray gets up, Orton's like, I'm done with this, hits a surprise RKO and wins. And then the House of Horrors match. I'm not even going to talk about it. Watch it. Because this was right after the final deletion with Matt and Jeff, which was a cult classic as far as it's so bad it's good. And WWE's like, we can do that, right? Wrong, not true, incorrect. It was an abomination. That was culminated in the fact that Jinder Mahal helped Bray Wyatt win, which led to Jinder Mahal winning the world title. So, and this was just the beginning of those cinematic match deals that ended up plaguing Bray Wyatt's career. Then hey, you did a cinematic match, I did a cinematic match which wasn't as good as your cinematic match, but you're back now, so we should be a team. We get Matt Hardy and Bray Wyatt. At a time when Matt Hardy meant more than Bray Wyatt, because Bray Wyatt meant absolutely dick all of nothing at that point. His reputation had been, I lose every major feud I'm in. Even against the Demon, which was coming up right around this time, where the Demon versus Bray Wyatt could have been billed as something, but no, it was pretty blah, and nobody really cared, you know. And then they did the, you know, it was Bray Wyatt that caused the broken gimmick to come back out of, or the woken gimmick in that case with Matt, and they did that whole thing with the two of them, and their tag team was fun, you know, it was fun, but it was just, who cared, you know. It's Matt overstayed where the woken gimmick overstayed its welcome, and I think Matt realized that, which is why he left. And then Wyatt, at that point, the swamp gimmick was just so dead. It was 2017, 2018. He had lost so many feuds. The people they were done with it. They were done with him. It's not even that they were done with the swamp gimmick, but they were done with him. Until the Fiend showed up and brought intrigue back. And this is what I was talking about before about the timing of Bray Wyatt. because a lot of the time with Bray in that spooky gimmick, it didn't work because the timing was off and he was not treated properly and he lost most of the feuds he was in. Even if he was getting a match win here and there, he wasn't being treated like he should have. The horror gimmick had overstayed its welcome. It had been there for 4 years at that point, for 5 years at that point, and it wasn't working, and the people didn't believe it, and the people didn't accept it, and the people didn't want it, and they didn't want him until he came back with that fresh coat of paint right when people were really losing hope about WWE and having an intriguing gimmick again. All of a sudden, the Fiend has mystique, has an aura about him. He's scared, and then we get the vignettes with the Firefly Funhouse with like Happy Mr., Demon Mr. Rogers Bray, and that split personality, and it worked. It blended things together. It made these vignettes where you could see that there's something really sinister with Bray, and that when the Fiend comes, it just he turns into somebody else psychotic. And that was working until they put him in that Hell in a Cell match with Seth Rollins. Now, I've found a way to fix this match, but you're going to have to wait to find out how. Because I think that match can be fixed. If you're going to do a non-finish for a Hell in a Cell, which is really what the legacy of the Fiend ended up becoming at this point, of they destroyed the rules and the aura and the feeling of Hell in a Cell more than they already had by causing a referee's decision to end the match, because Seth Rollins, of all people, was the person who couldn't be contained, even though the whole point was that Bray was going to no-sell it and take down Seth anyway, even though he wasn't going to win the belt, which was the whole point, which is why you don't book that match to begin with. But they had the match. They do the DQ finish with the sledgehammer and the chairs and the curb stomp and the referee count out and the red lighting and all that. And that match did a lot of people into WWE in general. And it did no favors for the Fiend because it was not like that made him look any more dangerous. Now, if they did what could have been done, where Bray Wyatt is the one who beat the piss out of Seth Rollins and then goes to snap Seth's neck with that thing that he does where he holds his head and, kind of pulls both hands both ways and makes it look like he's snapping his neck, Triple H comes down, or Vince comes down and goes, all right, that's enough, Bray. That's enough. And he's getting ready to do it. He's like, you do that, I'm calling this match. And then he's getting ready, and you hear him laughing, and then you can hear Triple H or Vince go, Wyndham! Using his real name, and then everyone's like, oh, this is real. And then, or at least people are a little bit more into like, hey, okay, maybe this isn't right. And there's no music to that either. They would just come down, and then the Fiend, not caring, snaps the neck. Vince or Triple H, probably Triple H at this point, goes, well, ring the damn bell, get the cage up. Get the cage up. That man's neck might be broken. And then police go in there and arrest that man. That man just tried to kill Seth, our champion. And then the police come in and break and fuck around with them until they finally pin him down, and he's laughing as he's getting arrested. And, and then you could even have him in the Fiend mask, or even not. You could take the Fiend mask off and just have Bray demonically laughing, and then have him come out. If you're going to do a non-finish, have it be from the guys leading the thing, not just a referee, and have it be the guy you're trying to push as the Unstoppable Monster doing the Unstoppable Monster stuff. But let's not get into that too much now. Because the Fiend comes in and destroys Finn Balor with the Sister Abigail and then the Mandible Claw. And that was prior to this Seth Rollins match for the Universal title. And it's going well, and it's going well, and it's going well until Seth Rollins wins the Fiend beats Rollins for the Universal Championship at Saudi Arabia. And the second that he won this belt on Halloween, no less, because, of course, the second that happened, I know for a fact, at least from my mind, and I know for a fact from Skylar's, I believe in JoshAgeddon's, that the worst thing you could do for a gimmick like that is give him the belt that early into it, and after that whole Hell in a Cell shenanigans. Because if he wins that belt, that means he's got to lose that belt. And the last thing you want to do with a gimmick like that doesn't need a belt to be over is give him a belt so that he can lose the belt and lose all the mystique that he had. which is exactly what happened. Because the man he lost to at another Saudi Arabia show, no less, was also was against Goldberg. A 52-year-old Goldberg, where the Fiend, and that was the nail in the coffin. That was it. There was no more Fiend being considered legitimate because everybody then realized, oh, it's still Bray Wyatt. Yeah, he's the Fiend, but he's still going to go through the same happy horse shit where he does a bunch of promos, he gets into a match, and then when it comes to a guy who he should beat by all accounts that would actually get him over, he has to lose. And nobody cared anymore. Nobody cared anymore after that. I don't care what the Crown Prince wanted, but what he was up to that point versus what he became after that is very indicative. Then we get 2020. And the pandemic happens, and we get the Firefly Funhouse. Now, at least to the defense of WWE, and to Bray Wyatt as well, they were trying here, right? They were trying to do something innovative and different that was going to be different considering the circumstances surrounding what they had to do to alter what WrestleMania ended up becoming. And having it be done in the Performance Center with almost nobody, and that was but that weird, basically acid trip cinematic match is the only win Bray Wyatt has ever had at WrestleMania. Think about that. That's the only win he had, was a cinematic garbage match where that basically made fun of the fact that you watched pro wrestling when it was actually pro wrestling. Which is why I'm very mixed emotions about that match, about that cinematic adventure, because while there was a lot of good lore that was put in and details that were put in, it was still quite disrespectful to the era before it. At least the way that I felt about it. And, you could see, or I believe we were around at that point in professional wrestling, at least in the podcast. So I believe we do have a WrestleMania review of that WrestleMania because it was just so weird. And if not, there is one on TAW Gaming that we did that I know we have a review of it somewhere. But he does that match, and then they start doing more cinematics. He has that match with Braun at Extreme Rules, the Swamp Fight, which was just disgustingly bad. And then it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. They added Alexa Bliss with the doll. They had the Inferno match. Oh my God. The Inferno match. The best part about the Braun Strowman Bray Wyatt match that they had after that Swamp Fight was the fact that Roman Reigns pinned Braun Strowman to win the belt because Roman Reigns came back in a match against them the month prior, and Roman Reigns winning the belt going, thank God we've got it off this piece of garbage. Not talking about Braun Strowman, but this feud, which is a piece of garbage. And then Bray Wyatt goes and does even worse stuff. Because then he goes back to his old friend Randy Orton. And this is where things just started getting out of control. And even the people who like Bray Wyatt and tried to believe in Bray Wyatt could not anymore. It couldn't anymore. Because there was no justification for it. There's nothing redeemable about that. Just the hokiness, the silliness. And I know, it's pandemic. It's Thunderdome. I get it. You're limited in what you can do. But that Firefly Inferno match was arguably one of the worst matches I've ever seen. Bray Wyatt got caught on fire by accident. And that was the match. And then he gets set on fire. They set his whole body on fire because Randy Orton has a very hard time getting a gas can to work. They set the doll on fire, which is very clearly a doll. Then they have that Randy Orton Alexa Bliss match. I kid you not, folks. If you didn't see this, I'm sparing you, where Alexa Bliss threw a fireball like Spider-Man above Randy Orton's head. And it ended with Bray Wyatt coming out as the Fiend, looking like a glossy, glittery shredder in a half-melted Fiend mask, coming out of the ring and hitting Orton with a Sister Abigail, and then Alexa Bliss hopping on Randy Orton's dangalang. And then that match led to the WrestleMania match that they had, which had an even more bizarre Firefly Funhouse rule. And that ended with another one RKO loss to Orton after lights go out and come back on, and Alexa Bliss has got a black goo emitting crown of thorns on that Bray got confused by, and then Orton wins again. And then then Alexa Bliss is like, this is my gimmick now. Bray's done. And that's the last we see of him before he I don't want to say retires, because now we might be seeing more of it. That was the last of the WWE because there was nowhere else they could go with him. There was nothing they could do with him. And at that point, nobody gave a fuck. Everybody wanted that dude as far away from their television viewing eyes as possible. Even the people who were diehard for him were done with him. Because they knew there's no repairing Bray Wyatt. Until now. Because there's a lot of speculation with this White Rabbit gimmick going on that at Extreme Rules, he's going to come back as the White Rabbit. And they've done a lot of really cryptic messages that a lot of people are putting the pieces together to say, yes, it is going to be Bray Wyatt. But can this be lightning striking for Bray for a third time? Can it be a perfect, the right guy for the right gimmick at the right time, as it was at the initial setup of the Swamp gimmick, as it was in the initial setup of the Fiend, and might be here in the initial setup of the White Rabbit? But the question is, can they sustain it? Will Triple H be able to treat Bray Wyatt in whatever iteration this becomes? Will it be able to be sustained? How much supernatural shit are they going to do that makes him look like a total knobend? And is he going to win a feud from time to time? None of those things are guaranteed. It's a giant question mark. And at this point, my question is, with Bray Wyatt's personality, with his promo skills being unmatched and being so wholly unique and what's really kept him as a personality and somebody people want to see leading up to this point, is there any way that Bray, having taken about a year off, is going to be a better wrestler because of, as the White Rabbit? Probably not. Are we going to like his matches? Maybe. Depends on how overbooked and how silly and how supernatural they decide to get with it. If they kept Bray Wyatt to basically doing his persona, having whatever persona he's doing and doing his linguistics that are always A grade, good promo, always a good promo, and then have him do some decent matches. Doesn't have to be perfect, but stuff where he can win occasionally. In the mind of the people, if there's anyone who's going to be able to rehab Bray Wyatt, it's going to be Triple H. But is Bray Wyatt savable? And that's the real question here, and that's something I am very intrigued to find out. If it is true that Bray Wyatt is in fact the White Rabbit that they've been alluding to, which by all accounts and all the clues, I don't see how it can't be at this point. But if Bray Wyatt is in fact coming back as the White Rabbit, Triple H is going to have to do a lot to convince people that it's not the way it was for the past 10 years. And I don't know whether Triple H has got that in him. And I don't know whether Bray Wyatt's got that in him. But the only way that we're going to find out is when we see him, if we see him, come Extreme Rules. And folks, that's where I'm going to see you next time. Because we are going to watch Extreme Rules on Saturday. JoshAgeddon and I are going to simulcast with TAW and Court-Martail Podcast our reactions to the show, how it went, where do we think things are headed. It's the third Triple H era pay-per-view that I'm watching. He's 2 for 2 so far as good shows go. Can he make it 3 for 3, and can he make me care about Bray Wyatt again? Only time will tell. But until then, it is time to go to our first commercial break. Thank you all for riding with me for the past hour and 40 minutes, talking about all sorts of things. We've had quite a long podcast today. Next week, Extreme Rules. It's going to be a great time. Stick to it. I am your Colonial Champion, Sean McCarty, and I will see you right after this short break.